It was the kind of morning that felt like a promise and a warning all at once. The prairie stretched endlessly, bathed in the first light of dawn, a sky full of soft oranges and pinks. The air was cool, the stillness so deep it almost felt like the world was holding its breath. Carter Elwood, a rancher who knew the land like the back of his hand, was out early, checking his fences. But as he neared the creek, he froze. There, by the water's edge, were three children, too weak to walk, too pale to be alive. They were collapsed in the grass, looking like they'd been abandoned by life itself. The smallest of the three, an infant, was barely moving. A fever had taken her small body hostage. The other two, a little boy and a girl, lay sprawled on the ground, their clothes torn, their feet bruised and bloody. Carter's heart hammered as he rode closer, his boots hitting the ground heavy with dread. Kneeling beside them was a woman, a mother, who looked as worn as the prairie itself. Her hands were trembling as she stroked the baby's hot forehead, whispering something under her breath. "They haven't eaten in 4 days," the woman said, her voice breaking. "And he's coming." Carter's blood ran cold. "Who?" he asked, but the woman didn't answer, her gaze darting nervously toward the distant hills. Then Carter heard it. Hooves. The pounding of horses, coming fast, too fast. Whoever he was, Carter knew this wasn't a visit of mercy. His grip tightened on the reins, instinctively pulling his horse back. The woman's voice cracked as she muttered a prayer under her breath, and Carter didn't wait for an explanation. He didn't need one. There was no time for that. He assessed the children quickly. The baby, feverish and barely breathing. The boy, shivering but still alive. The girl, lying on her stomach, her eyes closed in exhaustion. "Get them to the ranch now," Carter muttered to himself. He made the decision in a heartbeat. There was no other choice. He needed to get them to safety, and fast. Carter dismounted in one smooth motion and gently lifted the baby. She was burning with fever, her tiny body too limp in his arms. His heart tightened as he carried her, praying she'd stay with him long enough to get to safety. The girl, Mabel, stirred slightly, trying to get up. "No, no," Carter said softly, reaching for her, but she could barely lift her head before collapsing again. He carried the baby to his horse, placing her carefully in the saddle. With a deep breath, Carter turned and returned to the boy. John, he thought the boy's name was. He was semi-conscious, whimpering in fear and pain. Carter scooped him up, his breath coming in quick gasps. The boy's arms were too weak to even hold on, but he didn't seem to notice. Carter hurried, holding him close to his chest. He couldn't risk wasting another moment. Mabel, still on the ground, tried to move again, but her legs buckled. Carter's heart sank. She was too weak. He reached down and gently lifted her, cradling her against his side. The journey was 2 miles, but it felt like a lifetime. The sun was barely starting to rise, and Carter's legs ached with the weight of the children in his arms. Mabel was delirious, her eyes wide with fever and confusion. "Are you an angel?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No, honey," Carter said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "Just a man who's going to get you home." John hadn't said a word, but his heavy breathing was a reminder that he was still with them. Carter kept his pace steady, his eyes scanning the horizon. The hoofbeats, the ones that had sent the woman into such a panic, were growing louder. Every muscle in Carter's body tensed. Whoever was following them was getting closer. The ranch house finally appeared in the distance, a welcome sight that made Carter's heart swell with a flicker of hope. He pushed forward, his horse's hooves kicking up dirt, and finally, they reached the gate. He kicked it open, barely pausing to let the children off his horse. He ran inside, carrying the baby and laying her gently on the kitchen table. Myra, the woman who had been praying beside the creek, followed him in, her face pale and strained. She knelt beside the baby as Carter poured cool water from a pitcher onto a cloth, wiping the baby's forehead. Her small chest rose and fell shallowly, her breathing faint but still there. Carter whispered a prayer of his own. Slowly, the baby's eyes fluttered open. Carter let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Just as he turned to check on the other two, there was a noise from outside. Hoofbeats. Get them upstairs. Lock the door, he ordered, his voice hard, sharp. He didn't wait for Myra to respond. He grabbed the shotgun from the wall and stepped onto the porch. The dust was thick in the air, swirling as three riders emerged from the haze. The first man, a tall figure with a cruel, entitled look, was unmistakable. Carter recognized him instantly. Papa, Myra's father-in-law. A chill ran down his spine, and for the first time that morning, Carter felt his resolve waver. The riders were closing in, and a real fight, it seemed, was only just beginning. Carter's pulse quickened as he faced the three riders approaching through the dust. The lead man, Papa, a tall figure with cruel eyes, had a menacing presence, his face twisted with entitlement. He was flanked by two sons, Jeremiah, who looked eager for a fight, and Caleb, who seemed to hesitate, his unease barely hidden behind a hardened expression. The hooves of their horses beat steadily against the dry earth as they closed in on the ranch house, their weapons evident in their hands. Papa's voice carried over the wind, rough and demanding. That's my blood inside. Hand them over. Carter's gaze never wavered as he stood firm, his hand resting on the shotgun's barrel. No, he replied calmly, a simple word that carried an unspoken promise of resistance. Papa's eyes narrowed with growing fury. He dismounted and stepped forward, trying to tower over Carter. You don't know what you're dealing with, cowboy. Those children belong to me. They're my grandchildren. His voice dripped with authority, but Carter could see the cracks in it. The desperation, the lies. They've been through hell, and you're the one who put them there. Carter shot back, his voice steady, unwavering. The law's for protecting people, not torturing them. Those kids are safe here. You won't touch them. Papa sneered, clearly trying to intimidate him. He moved closer, his hand lingering near the handle of his revolver. I can make this go real bad for you. You think you're some kind of hero? This is family business, and you're not a part of it. Jeremiah stepped forward, a wicked grin spreading across his face, his hand reaching for his pistol. Carter's eyes narrowed. He could feel the weight of the shotgun in his hands, the cold steel and assurance. You pull that, you'd better be faster than me, Carter warned, his voice low and deadly. Jeremiah hesitated, his eyes flicking between Carter and the gun, but he didn't draw it. Caleb, his face a picture of uncertainty, stood frozen, his hand hovering at his own weapon. He was the weakest link. The tension in the air was palpable, a standoff between two men, neither willing to back down. Papa's gaze flicked between them, the situation slowly slipping beyond his control. You've made a mistake, cowboy, Papa snarled, his hand finally retreating from his gun. We'll be back with the law. He turned, motioning for his sons to mount their horses. This isn't over. The three of them rode off, their dust trailing behind them like a bad omen. Carter didn't let his guard down until they were out of sight, his eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for any sign that they might return. Myra appeared at the door, her face pale, her expression torn between relief and dread. She didn't speak, just stood there watching him, her hands trembling at her sides. Inside, the children remained in their room, unaware of the confrontation that had just taken place. Carter's jaw clenched, his eyes briefly flickering toward the doorway before he made his way inside. The children needed him. The baby, Nina, was resting, her breathing slow but steady. The color was slowly returning to her cheeks, a sign of hope. John, though still shaken, was awake. His eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead, as if the world around him was a distant memory. Mabel was sitting up in bed, her face bright with confusion and fear. Is the bad man gone? She asked softly, her voice trembling. Carter's heart tightened at the sight of her. Yes, little bird. "He's gone for now," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. He moved toward the children, checking on each of them with a steady hand, his mind working furiously. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The truth was, Papa wasn't just a father-in-law. He was a man with power, a man who wasn't used to losing. Carter couldn't afford to make a mistake. He needed to protect Myra and the kids, and he knew that meant preparing for what was coming next. But first, Myra needed to know what had happened. He could see the fear still in her eyes, even as she tried to be brave for her children. She stepped closer, her voice breaking as she finally spoke. "I've made this your fight, haven't I?" she asked, her words filled with shame. Carter shook his head. "No, I chose to help. This is my fight now, too." Myra's eyes filled with unshed tears as she lowered her gaze, her fingers trembling. She sat down heavily in a chair, looking defeated. Carter sat beside her, his gaze never leaving her face as she began to tell her story. "My husband died 6 months ago. Cholera. Left me with nothing but debts. Debts to Papa," she said, her voice thick with pain. "He demanded I pay them off. By marrying him." She looked up at Carter, her eyes filled with horror as she continued. "He said I had no choice. He said I owed him, and that meant giving him the children too." Carter's hands balled into fists at the thought, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "When I refused, he locked us in the cellar. 3 days, no food. We were starving. And when we got out, we ran." Her voice broke, and she wrapped her arms around herself. Carter's anger flared, but he kept his voice calm. "You're not going back. Ever," he said firmly. He stood up, his mind racing. The next step was clear. He needed a plan to prepare for the fight that was coming. He couldn't let Papa take them. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. The first proper meal they'd had in days was a simple one: broth, bread, canned peaches, but it was enough to help them start healing. John ate slowly, almost mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere, while Mabel guarded her food fiercely, her fear of it being taken away still strong. But for the first time in days, they were together, safe, at least for now. As the evening came, Carter found himself on the porch again, rifle in hand. The night was thick with the sound of distant coyotes, a reminder of how precarious their safety still was. Myra joined him quietly, the two of them standing side by side, staring into the darkness. "What if he comes back tonight?" Myra asked, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Carter's answer was firm. "Then he'll regret it." They both stared into the night, waiting. Every rustle of the wind, every sound from the distant hills had them on edge. Carter's thoughts kept drifting to the children and to the fight he knew was coming. The storm was far from over. But for the first time since he'd found Myra and her children by the creek, he felt the spark of something in his chest. Hope. The hours passed in tense silence as Carter and Myra sat on the porch, the weight of their thoughts pressing down on them. The distant stars glimmered overhead, the only source of light in the stillness that surrounded them. Myra's hand rested on the railing, her eyes scanning the darkness, her thoughts clearly with the children inside. Carter's mind, however, was running in a different direction. The stakes had never been clearer. He couldn't let Papa and his sons come back and take them. He had to act fast. The small ranch, once a solitary place of quiet and solitude, had become something more: a fortress, a sanctuary, and a target. Carter glanced at Myra, her face shadowed in the dim light. "You know, I had a family once," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "A wife and a son. Fever took them both 5 years back. I kept this place running because I didn't know what else to do. It was like being already dead." Myra turned to look at him, her hand finding his. Her fingers were warm, comforting, a connection that neither of them had expected, but now couldn't ignore. "And now," she asked softly, "now, I remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting," he replied, his gaze hardening. Myra nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. They both knew there was no turning back now. With the decision made, Carter rose, his mind already turning toward the next step. "We need to get to Blackwater," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "There's a judge there, Morrison. Honest man. If I can get him to see the children in their condition, he'll help. We can get a protective order, and maybe, just maybe, we can stop this before it gets worse." Myra nodded slowly, but her face was tight with worry. "What about the sheriff?" she asked, her voice laced with fear. Carter's face darkened. "Sheriff's Papa's friend. He won't help us." The thought of the law being on Papa's side made Carter's stomach twist. The legal system, corrupted by influence and power, wasn't going to save them. But the judge, the honest judge in Blackwater, might. Carter spread out a map on the table in the dim light of the cabin, tracing his finger along the route to Blackwater. 40 miles east. The distance seemed impossible with the threat of Papa looming over them, but it was the only hope they had. "We'll need to gather evidence. Document the children's injuries, the bruises on Myra's wrists, the forged debt contracts. It'll be the only way to prove Papa's abuse and the false claims he's made," Carter said, his mind racing through the steps. Myra looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern. "And what if you're not back in time?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. The possibility of Carter leaving them unprotected hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Carter met her gaze, his expression hard but tender. "If I'm not back in time, you'll be ready." Widow Johnson's agreed to help. She's a tough woman, armed and ready to hold the line if Papa tries anything. Myra nodded, swallowing hard, but Carter could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. "You'll teach me how to use a rifle, right?" she asked quietly. "I will," Carter promised. "You'll be ready, and Widow Johnson will be watching over the children." His voice softened, though the gravity of the situation never fully left. "I won't take long, Myra. I'll get the judge and marshal, and I'll be back. I swear it." The preparation was relentless. Carter spent the next hours readying his horse, making sure it was packed with enough supplies for the journey, and then checking and rechecking his rifle. Myra's hands shook as she practiced, loading her own weapon under Carter's watchful eye, learning quickly but still trembling with uncertainty. Widow Johnson, a tough woman in her 60s, showed up with a grim smile and a loaded rifle of her own. "Nobody's getting past me, Carter," she declared, standing tall on the porch with the rifle cradled in her arms like it was second nature. Carter nodded, grateful for her presence. It was a small relief in the midst of the storm building around them. Inside, the children were slowly recovering. Nina's fever had broken, and her small, fragile body was starting to regain some of its color. Mabel, though still quiet and wary, was exploring the house cautiously, her little hands brushing over the furniture as though she was testing the solidity of the world around her. John, though, still seemed distant, his eyes hollow and unfocused, as though the trauma of their ordeal had yet to leave him. But there were small signs of life returning. Mabel had even begun asking questions about the house, about Carter, about what happened next. Carter couldn't help but smile as she bombarded him with her endless curiosity. "Are you an angel?" she had asked again, her voice full of wonder. Carter had laughed, shaking his head. "No, little bird. Just a man who's doing what he can." It was moments like these, small, tender moments, that kept him going. They were all going to survive this. Carter spent the rest of the evening carving a small wooden bird, a simple thing, but one that would be something for Mabel to keep. "Keep this safe for me until I return," he told her softly as he handed it to her. "Promise you'll keep it safe?" Mabel's big brown eyes had searched his face, and she nodded solemnly. "I promise," she said, clutching the little bird to her chest like it was the most precious thing she had. Carter smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head before leaving her in the care of Myra and Widow Johnson. The morning came too soon. The sky a dull gray as Carter saddled his horse. He gave Myra a final, lingering kiss on the cheek, his hand resting on her shoulder for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll be back," he promised again, his voice rough with emotion. "Stay safe." If anything happens, you run. Don't fight. Myra's eyes met his, the unspoken fear in them mirroring his own. I'm done running. Carter, she said quietly, her voice fierce. Carter nodded. Then, with one final glance back, he mounted his horse and rode off, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The sun was barely up as he disappeared into the distance, headed toward Blackwater and the hope that lay there. But as he rode, a chill ran through him. Something didn't feel right. In the distance, he saw a dust cloud rising from the wrong direction. It wasn't his horse. It was Papa. And this time, he wasn't alone. Carter's heart sank as he realized they had come back, and with 4 men this time. Papa's arrival was like the first crack of thunder before the storm. Carter had barely ridden a few miles when the dust cloud rose from the wrong direction. His heart dropped as he recognized the familiar shape of Papa's riders. And this time, they weren't alone. With them were 2 additional men, and to Carter's horror, a sheriff's deputy. His stomach twisted. This wasn't a simple confrontation anymore. It was a siege. Carter's mind raced, cursing himself for leaving. He had been too hasty, too trusting. He should have known Papa wouldn't give up so easily. The sky, once pale and promising, now seemed to weigh heavily on him as he spurred his horse into a faster gallop, desperate to get back before Papa reached the house. Back at the ranch, Myra was already in motion, her face pale with fear as she hurried the children down to the cellar. Widow Johnson, ever vigilant, positioned herself in the upstairs window, the rifle in her hands steady and firm. Myra stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, her body trembling but resolute, ready to protect her children at all costs. Carter arrived just as Papa's men dismounted and started making their way up to the porch, their boots thudding heavily against the dirt. Papa, still as imposing as ever, sneered when he saw Myra standing there, her back straight, determined. "Time's up, Myra. You can come willingly or in chains," he growled, his voice full of venom. His gaze flicked toward the house, searching for the children. "Where are my grandchildren?" "Safe from you," Myra answered, her voice trembling but defiant. She stood her ground, her finger resting on the rifle, though her hand shook slightly. Papa's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, trying to intimidate her. "You think you can protect them? You're just a woman, and I've got the law on my side," he sneered. The deputy, a young man who looked like he didn't want any part of this, stepped forward nervously, his voice hesitant. "Ma'am, if you owe debts, I owe him nothing but contempt," Myra shot back, her voice steady. "And you, deputy, should be ashamed of yourself." Papa laughed coldly, stepping closer, clearly enjoying the fear he was instilling in her. "I've got the law, Myra. You don't have a leg to stand on." "Laws for protecting people," she retorted, her grip tightening on the rifle. "Not for allowing men like you to destroy families." The words hit their mark. Papa stopped in his tracks, eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had always thought he could control everything with threats, but Myra's defiance was something he hadn't expected. The tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable. "You can't fight me forever, Myra. I'll take what's mine." "You'll never touch them again," Myra said through gritted teeth. It was the promise of a woman who had suffered enough, who was willing to fight with everything she had to protect her children. Papa didn't take kindly to being defied. He motioned for Jeremiah to move toward the door, clearly intent on forcing his way inside. "You want to try that?" Myra asked, her voice low, her finger brushing the trigger. She wasn't backing down. "One more step, and I'll shoot." Widow Johnson's voice rang out from the upstairs window, firm and unyielding. "One more step, and I'll shoot, Papa. Try me." Papa's gaze flicked toward the house, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, realizing he wasn't facing a frightened woman anymore, but someone who would stand her ground. "I don't have time for this," Papa muttered, his voice edged with frustration. "You can't stop me." He motioned for his men to spread out. and Carter's heart raced as he realized what was happening. They weren't just here for the children, they were surrounding the house, closing in on all sides. His mind worked frantically. Widow Johnson was a sharp shot, but she couldn't hold them off alone. There was no way they could survive a siege with the odds stacked so heavily against them. The situation had turned from bad to worse. He needed to get back to the house, needed to help Myra and Widow Johnson hold their ground. Every part of him screamed to do something, anything, but he had left them vulnerable. His breath caught in his throat as he thought of the children, hiding in the cellar, scared and confused. If this escalated into a fight, what would happen to them? Carter's eyes flicked to the horizon, searching for any sign of help. The law was too far away, and they couldn't depend on it anymore. They were on their own. Then the realization hit him. He had made a mistake. He had trusted that he could leave, that he could find the judge in time, but he hadn't accounted for Papa's speed, for the cruelty that ran deep in his veins. They hadn't just been fighting for survival. They were fighting for their very lives. Papa was relentless, and this wouldn't end without bloodshed. But Myra wasn't backing down. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Defiance. She wasn't the woman who had been praying over her children at the creek anymore. She was a mother fighting for her family, and she was prepared to do whatever it took. Papa paced in front of the house, his voice rising in anger, demanding they give up the children. But Myra's response was firm. "You don't get to decide that," she said, her voice cold. Carter's hand tightened on the reins, the weight of the rifle pressing against his chest. He couldn't let it come to this, but he also couldn't let Papa win. Just then, as the tension reached a boiling point, he heard something, hooves, the sound of horses galloping toward them. Papa smirked, thinking it was the sheriff, but Carter's heart skipped. This wasn't the sheriff. These riders were different. They were coming fast, and they weren't on Papa's side. Carter's breath caught as the riders came into view. They were here. They had arrived. The power was shifting. But the question was, would it be enough to stop Papa before he could do any more damage? The sound of hooves grew louder, drowning out the angry shouts of Papa and his men as they surrounded the house. Myra's grip on a rifle tightened, her breath shallow and quick, but she stood her ground, unwilling to let them take her children. For a moment, it seemed like time had stopped, the world hanging in the balance between fear and hope, between survival and defeat. Papa's eyes flicked toward the riders, a smirk tugging at his lips, as if he believed his victory was certain. "That'll be the sheriff," he sneered, his voice filled with a false sense of triumph. But as the riders came over the hill, Carter's heart soared. The dust cloud revealed the riders weren't from the sheriff's office. They were the cavalry he'd been waiting for. The first rider, tall and authoritative, was dressed in the distinct uniform of a federal marshal. The second, a man in a formal coat with a hard expression, was Judge Morrison, the very judge Carter had ridden to Blackwater to find. The third, a local doctor, rode alongside them, his face grim with purpose. It was a sight that gave Carter a surge of relief. Finally, help had arrived. Myra stood frozen for a heartbeat before stepping forward, her voice trembling with disbelief but filled with hope. Are they really here?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Carter didn't answer, not at first. Instead, he stood, his jaw clenched, his hand resting on the rifle as he watched the three riders approach. Papa's arrogance faltered when he saw the marshal's badge gleaming in the sunlight. His eyes flicked between the riders, his mind quickly calculating the implications of their arrival. He straightened, trying to salvage some of his bluster. "This is family business. Marshal, you've got no reason to interfere." The marshal, a man with a steady hand and a calm demeanor, didn't flinch. "Step away from the house, Papa." "Now," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. Judge Morrison, dismounting with the same cool authority, spoke next. "This is child endangerment and attempted kidnapping. You have no claim here, and your actions will be addressed." Papa's face darkened with rage. His fists clenched as his men shifted uneasily. The deputy, who had been hanging back, shifted uncomfortably on his horse, his eyes darting between Papa and the riders. Carter could see the deputy's discomfort, the guilt in his posture. The truth was undeniable now. Papa had no more power over them. He was a man backed into a corner, and he knew it. "You can't just take them from me," Papa growled, his voice thick with defiance. "These children are my blood. They're mine." Carter's eyes hardened, the weight of his anger pushing him to step forward. "You don't own them," he said, his voice full of quiet fury. "You never did. They're free now, and that freedom's something you'll never take from them again." The marshal moved to the front, his badge gleaming in the sunlight as he stepped between Papa and the house. "Lower your weapon, Papa," he ordered, his voice sharp, "or I'll make you." For a moment, it seemed like the world had paused, as if even Papa himself knew the game was up. His hand hovered near his revolver, but the fear of the law, the undeniable authority of the marshal and judge, kept him rooted in place. Caleb, who had been standing silently at the edge of the group, stepped forward, his face torn with guilt. "Judge," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'll testify. Papa's lying. He locked them in the cellar. I saw it. I couldn't stop it, but I'm not scared anymore." Papa's face twisted in pure rage, his hands shaking with fury. "You're no son of mine," he shouted, his voice raw with betrayal. Caleb, however, stood taller now, his face hardening. "Maybe that's a good thing," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of suppressed fear. Papa's fury only grew. "You'll regret this," he hissed, but the words held no weight anymore. His authority was slipping away, piece by piece. The judge turned to the marshal. "We've gathered all the evidence we need. The doctor's testimony, the children's injuries, the forged contracts. Papa's lies are exposed for all to see." The doctor, who had been carefully examining the children, stepped forward. "The children are malnourished, bruised, and traumatized. They've been abused, and it's a miracle they're still alive. These children nearly died from the conditions they were kept in." His words were like a hammer, striking the final blow to Papa's claims. Myra's breath hitched, but she stood tall, her face a mask of relief and newfound strength. Judge Morrison nodded, reviewing the evidence with a practiced eye. "These contracts are fraudulent," he said, his voice stern. "This signature doesn't match other documents. These debts were never legally binding." Papa's face paled, and his mouth moved, but no words came out. His defense crumbled before him. "You signed them, Myra," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Myra's voice was steady as she replied, "I never signed anything. You forged those contracts, and you know it." The marshal turned to the deputy, who had been uncomfortably silent, his gaze shifting between Papa and the riders. "Deputy, what's your take on this?" the marshal asked. The deputy hesitated, his eyes filled with reluctance. I was told she was dangerous, unstable, but I never thought." His words trailed off, the truth of his complicity hanging in the air. "This is kidnapping, deputy," the marshal cut in. "You're complicit in a crime, and you'll be held accountable for it." Caleb's voice broke through the tension again. "I'll testify. I saw what Papa did. I wasn't brave enough before, but I am now." Papa's face went crimson with rage, his hands trembling with fury. "You're a coward, Caleb," he spat. "You'll regret this." "I won't," Caleb replied, his voice firm. "I'm free now, Papa, and I'm not going back." The judge, satisfied with the evidence, issued an immediate protective order. "Papa, you're barred from any contact with these children. You will remain at least 100 miles away, and if you violate this order, you will be arrested. The contracts are void, and your claim to these children is nullified." Papa's face twisted in pure rage as he realized there was no more fight to be had. The marshal stepped forward, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "I'll personally make sure you comply, Papa," he said coldly, "and I'll be investigating those fraudulent contracts." This isn't over for you. Papa, his fury unchecked, sneered one last time before turning toward his men. This isn't over. I'll make sure of it, he hissed. Jeremiah, who had been silent during the entire exchange, grabbed his father's arm. We're leaving, Papa, he said, pulling him toward their horses. We'll deal with this later. Papa shot one last venomous glance at Myra and the children before he was dragged away, his men following behind him. The law had finally prevailed. The threat was over. The weight of the moment sank in, and Carter, his chest tight with relief, walked over to Myra. He didn't speak at first, his hands trembling as he took her in his arms. She clung to him, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. It's over, he whispered. You're safe now. 1 week had passed since the threat of Papa and his men had been vanquished, and in that time, a quiet transformation had taken place. The ranch, which had once felt like a battleground, was now beginning to pulse with the quiet rhythms of everyday life. The children, though still carrying the marks of their past, were starting to heal in ways that couldn't be measured by bruises or scars. Mabel, once a girl too afraid to smile, now followed Carter around the house, her small hands reaching out to touch the objects she had never dared explore before. She asked endless questions, her curiosity blossoming as she discovered the world outside the darkness she had once known. John, too, was slowly coming back to himself, his face still haunted by the trauma he had endured, but now more aware of the safety around him. His first full sentences were a quiet declaration that he was finally starting to understand that he didn't have to be afraid anymore. The most miraculous change, however, was in baby Nina. She had gained weight rapidly, her fever gone, and her eyes now sparkled with a life that had once seemed so fragile. She crawled across the floor, giggling when Carter scooped her up, his heart swelling with a love he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. The simple act of watching her laugh was a gift, one he would never take for granted again. Myra, too, was changing. The woman who had once been a shell of herself, worn down by grief and fear, was beginning to emerge from the shadows. She cooked meals with a quiet confidence, no longer the scared woman who had been unable to care for her children. She was beginning to lead, not just in the house, but in the community as well. Widow Johnson had already brought her to the women's social, and though Myra had been nervous, she had been accepted with warmth and open arms. The women had embraced her, offering not just their friendship, but their support, helping her rebuild a life she had once thought impossible. The ranch was beginning to feel like home, not just for Myra, but for all of them. The first proper meal they'd had in days had been the start of something new. And now, the house was filled with the everyday sounds of family coming together. Mabel was learning to gather eggs, John was learning to care for the chickens, and Carter found himself teaching them the rhythms of ranch life. Things he had taken for granted in the past, but now felt more important than ever. There was a rhythm to it all, feeding the animals, taking care of the land, and sitting down to dinner together each night. It was a rhythm that brought them peace, even if it was still new and tentative. During the day, Myra took on more of the household management, sorting through the accounts, making decisions with the quiet strength of someone who had found her footing again. She no longer flinched when someone approached too quickly, her posture straighter, more assured. It was clear that she was no longer the woman who had been broken by fear, but a woman who was rebuilding herself piece by piece. The evenings had become a time for quiet connection. After the children had gone to bed, Carter and Myra would sit on the porch together, sipping coffee in a silence that spoke volumes. Carter would carve small toys for the children, wooden animals and figures that would become treasured keepsakes, and Myra would mend the clothes they'd been given by the neighbors. The peaceful ritual of it was a balm for both of them, a way to heal the wounds they had carried for so long. One evening, as they sat together, Myra broke the silence. "I've been thinking about the future," she said quietly, her voice hesitant. Carter looked at her, his hands still as he carved. "Oh," he replied, his voice warm, encouraging. "What about it?" Myra shifted slightly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap. "The children are healing. I'm getting stronger. Eventually, I should find my own place, start over properly." The words hung in the air between them, and Carter's jaw tightened as he set the carving knife down. "That what you want?" he asked softly, the question more of a plea than anything. Myra looked away, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Asked what I should do, not what I want." Carter's gaze softened, his heart aching at the thought of her leaving. "What do you want, Myra?" he asked, his voice low, almost shy. The question seemed to hang in the air, unanswered for a long moment. Myra looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a deep longing. "I want to stop feeling like a guest in the first place that's ever felt like home," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Carter stood up suddenly, pacing a few steps away before turning back to her. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes uncertain. "I'm not good with words, Myra," he said, his voice rough. "But I think I've been doing the wrong thing all this time, trying to fix everything for you, when maybe what you needed was just to be heard." Myra rose from her seat, crossing the space between them. "You've given me everything," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "You've given me a second chance. And now, I want to give you mine." Carter swallowed hard, stepping toward her. "I'm not asking for much, Myra. Just that you stay. That we make this place ours. That we stop pretending like we're still living in the past." He reached out and took her hands in his. "This place hasn't just been waiting for you. It's been waiting for us." Together, Myra's breath caught, and for a moment, she just stared at him, as though trying to make sense of the words, of the emotions that had been building between them for so long. Finally, a soft smile touched her lips. "Yes," she whispered, the word trembling on her lips. "Yes, Carter, I want this. I want you. I want our family." Carter pulled her close, his heart swelling as he kissed her forehead gently, a promise in that single touch. "We'll build something good here, Myra. Something real. Something worth fighting for." The moment felt like everything they had both been working toward, the culmination of months of struggle, pain, and healing. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't need words but was felt deeply in the hearts of both of them. The family they had been searching for, the future they had dreamed of, was finally within reach. And in that quiet moment, as they stood together under the stars, it felt like the world was finally starting to heal. 3 months had passed since the day Carter had stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching the dust trail pop his retreating figure. It felt like a lifetime ago, but at the same time, it had only been yesterday that they had been thrown into the chaos of fear, violence, and uncertainty. Now, the ranch that had once felt like a lonely fortress was a place brimming with life. It was a home, one they'd built together, one piece at a time. The ranch was different now. There was a sense of permanence in the way the house stood against the wide expanse of prairie, its windows no longer staring out emptily into the horizon, but now holding warmth and light within. Carter and Myra had created something beautiful out of the wreckage of their pasts, and it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The wedding day had arrived, a simple, intimate ceremony under the cottonwood tree that had stood tall in the yard since before either of them had arrived at the ranch. Judge Morrison, now a friend of the family, had agreed to officiate, his voice steady and strong as he spoke the words that would bind Carter and Myra together. Widow Johnson, who had been a constant source of strength and guidance, stood proudly as the matron of honor, her weathered face soft with pride. Mabel, with her newfound joy and laughter, was the flower girl, clutching a small wooden bird that Carter had carved for her in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. John, though still a little shy, had been entrusted with the rings, his hands trembling slightly as he held them on the pillow. Baby Nina, now chubby and full of life, clapped her hands in delight as she was passed between Carter and Myra, her giggles filling the air. The ceremony was short, but the vows they exchanged were filled with promises that would carry them through the rest of their lives. Carter looked at Myra, his voice steady but full of emotion as he spoke his vows. I swear to protect this family, not because you're weak, but because you're precious. To let you lead when you're strong and support you when you're weary. To love these children as my own because they already are. Myra's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she spoke her vows, her voice full of strength. I swear to trust you with my fear, to share my strength, to build this home together as equals, and to never forget that love isn't rescue, it's partnership. And when they exchanged rings, it felt like the world had finally righted itself. After the ceremony, the reception was simple but full of joy. The whole community came together to celebrate, bringing food, laughter, and music. The air was thick with the sounds of celebration as children ran freely through the yard, their laughter echoing in the wind. Mabel, with her flower crown perched proudly on her head, danced around Carter and Myra, her happiness so pure it was contagious. For Carter, there was nothing more beautiful than the sight of his family coming together. The life he thought was lost to him now alive in full color before him. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the prairie, Carter pulled Myra into his arms for their first dance as husband and wife. It was simple, a slow, gentle sway under the wide, open sky, but it was everything they had dreamed of, a moment of peace in the midst of everything they had fought for. There was no need for words between them. The way they held each other, the warmth in their embrace, said everything they needed to say. Their future was theirs to build. As the night drew to a close and the stars began to twinkle above them, Carter and Myra found themselves sitting on the porch once again, their hands intertwined, the sounds of the celebration still echoing in the distance. The warmth of the evening, the sounds of their children laughing inside the house, and the quiet hum of the world outside filled the air with a sense of belonging that they had never known before. "This is home," Myra whispered, her head resting on Carter's shoulder. Carter nodded, his heart swelling with a peace he hadn't known in years. "This is forever," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. They sat in silence for a long time, the stars above them a silent witness to the love and strength they had found in each other. It was the kind of peace that was hard-won, the kind that only came after facing the worst of the world and still choosing to love. The world had changed for them. The pain of the past, the trauma of their struggles, was still there, but it no longer defined them. What defined them now was their ability to move forward, to create something beautiful out of the ashes of their past. It was a love that had been forged in fire, one that had been tested and proven, and it was unbreakable. 6 months later, the ranch was a place of bustling joy. Winter had come, blanketing the prairie in a soft layer of snow, but inside, the house was warm with the sounds of life. Breakfast was a chaotic affair, children chattering, Myra managing the kitchen, Carter preparing for the day ahead. Mabel, now a few inches taller, helped John with his boots while Nina, always underfoot, toddled around, her infectious giggles filling the house. There was a sense of order to it all, a rhythm that felt right. Carter, who had once been so isolated, now found himself surrounded by love and laughter every day. The children were thriving. Mabel had started school, her bright eyes and eager mind taking in everything around her. John, still quiet, had come into his own, developing a love for carving just like Carter. Baby Nina, with her unrelenting energy, had begun to form words, her first mama bringing tears to Myra's eyes. And Myra, who had once been a shadow of herself, was now a pillar of strength and leadership, not just for her children, but for the entire community. She had become a respected voice among the women in town, leading charity events and helping others who had gone through similar struggles. She was no longer the woman who had hidden in fear. She was a woman who had found her purpose, and she was strong. One cold morning, as Carter was out feeding the cattle, a letter arrived, delivered by a marshal on horseback. Carter broke the seal, his eyes scanning the words quickly before he looked up at Myra, his face unreadable. "It's from the marshal," he said quietly. Myra walked over, her curiosity piqued. "What does it say?" Carter looked down at the letter once more, his expression softening. "Pop is dead, peacefully, in his sleep. Jeremiah is in jail for robbery, and Caleb's building a new life. He's married, and he's got a baby on the way. He sent an apology." Myra's breath caught, a weight lifting off her chest. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet relief. "And Caleb, he's free?" Carter nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "He's free, Myra. He's building something new, just like us." Myra stood still for a long moment, the final chapter of her past closing quietly. She didn't need to feel anger or bitterness anymore. It was over, and what remained was the peace she had fought so hard for. As spring arrived, the ranch was filled with new life. The creek, which had once been a place of fear and uncertainty, now shimmered with the colors of wildflowers that had begun to bloom. The family gathered together by the water one afternoon, the children laughing as they played, their feet kicking up the soft earth. Carter, Myra, Mabel, John, and Nina stood in a circle, planting flowers to honor where their journey had begun. Mabel's voice rang out as she placed the first flower in the ground. "To remember where we started," she said, her voice full of wonder. John placed a carved wooden cross next to the flowers, and Myra offered a prayer of thanks, her heart full as she spoke words of gratitude for the family they had built. Carter, standing beside her, looked down at her, his eyes filled with a love that had only grown stronger with time. "This is where I found you," he said softly. Myra smiled, her hand resting on his arm. "This is where we found each other," she whispered, her voice full of love and peace. It was a moment of perfect harmony, a moment when the past and the future came together, when everything that had been broken was healed. The weight of their struggles was gone, replaced by the joy of knowing they had created something beautiful together. As the sun set behind them, casting a golden light over the prairie, Carter and Myra knew that their journey was far from over. There would always be challenges, but they had each other, and together, they had built a life that was worth fighting for. The journey had come full circle. The creek, once a place of fear and despair, was now a sacred place, a symbol of their strength, their resilience, and their love. And as the stars began to twinkle above them, Carter held Myra close, his heart full of gratitude and hope. Their family was whole, their future bright, and together they were ready for whatever came next.